As those of you who've attended the previous two programs in this series now know, the MHS also holds an extensive collection of manuscript material from the early China-America trading period, a small selection of which is on view upstairs in our treasures gallery. This material came to the Historical Society when the American China Trade Museum in Milton, Massachusetts converted to the Forbes House Museum in the 1980s. It's the inspiration for this program series. Here at the MHS, we make all of our collections available to the public for free. We also produce an active roster of public programs, academic seminars, and workshops for educators. We're able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. If you appreciate these resources and programs like tonight's, and are not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider joining MHS. And I have the pleasure of introducing our panel this evening. Gwenn Miller is an associate professor of history at the College of the Holy Cross and is currently working on a book on John Perkins Cushing and Boston's early China trade. Gwenn received her doctorate from Duke University, and her research fields include colonial and revolutionary era America, Native America, and global connections of early America. Her first book, titled Kodiak Creole, Communities of Empire in Early Russian America, is on the Russian-American fur trade in the early 19th century and was published in 2015. Gwenn was also a New England Consortium Fellow in the fall of 2018 when she conducted research at MHS, and she has been a great help to us as we plan this program series. Dane A. Morrison is a professor of early American history at Salem State University and has served as the president of the New England Historical Association and New England Regional World History Association. He graduated from Boston College and received his PhD degree from Tufts University. His research has focused on contacts between early America and the other, appearing in A Praying People, Massachusetts Acculturation and the Failure of the Puritan Mission, 1600 to 1690. True Yankees, The South Seas and the Discovery of American Identity, and the forthcoming Yankees Abroad, Critical Themes in World History, and Eastward of Good Hope, Early America in a Dangerous World. Quite prolific, I see. He is also the editor of American Indian Studies, an interdisciplinary approach to contemporary issues, and co-editor of Salem Place Myth and Memory. Caroline Frank is the recently retired director of Brown University's master's program in American Studies. Her research and teaching cut across the disciplines of history and visual and material culture studies, focusing on global interaction of the Americas from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Caroline runs the research initiative Asia Pacific in the Making of the Americas. Her publications include Objectifying China, Imagining America, Chinese Commodities in Early America, and with Patricia Johnston, Global Trade and Visual Arts in Federal New England. She teaches courses focused on early American history, social justice, and museum studies, and has spent the last 2 years taking students to museums in the US and abroad to critically examine Western and non-Western representations of indigenous peoples. Caroline earned her BA and MA in anthropology from the University of Chicago, and an MA in museum studies and a PhD in American civilizations from Brown. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Sarah. At the panel last week, we talked very broadly about Boston's global connections through the China trade. And today, our speakers, Caroline and Dane, are going to turn more towards individual stories, right? But before that, I thought I know many of you were here last week, but I thought I might just give a very, very brief recap of some of the broad themes. So we'll start with the U.S. Right after the Revolution. So when the U.S. was cut off from trade with the British West Indies at the time of the American Revolution, there was a great sense of urgency to find other venues of trade to keep the new nation afloat and even to prove its viability to the rest of the world. So in addition to items and bodies that came from the Atlantic world through the slave trade, Europeans had sought out the luxuries of the China trade for centuries. And now, free from the monopolistic British East India Company, which had controlled this trade through the colonial era, American merchants jumped into the fray of the China trade, right? So it had a couple of different possibilities. So certainly citizens of the new republic were well acquainted with the many Chinese goods, from porcelains to silks to teas, the luxuries that you might imagine. However, they continually searched for goods that would be appealing to the Chinese. And so silver was always valued by the Chinese, but it was very difficult to obtain because really the Spanish and other Europeans controlled the flow of silver. So they looked for other items of trade, and they found some short-term success with things like American ginseng, which was found in the North Woods, sandalwood, which was gathered from the islands of Hawaii. We talked about this last week. The curious small marine creatures called bêche de mer, which I was doing a search for something else today, and a whole story about bêche de mer in Alaska popped up. I don't know if anybody else saw that today, but it popped up when I was looking at something else on my computer today. And also, so these things were found in the islands of the Pacific. People had to dive for them. Again, they're difficult to obtain. And also swallows' nests, the glutinous fibers of swallows' nests were appealing to the Chinese palate. So these things that were difficult to obtain and had kind of provided short-term success in trade. But what they did find, precisely at the time of the Revolution, merchants on the East Coast were delighted to learn that the most profitable answer to finding something that would be desirable to the Chinese was in the North Pacific sea otter. So these are luxuriant pelts. John Ledyard, who is from Connecticut, I will not give the long version of his story, but he sailed with Captain James Cook into the Pacific on his third voyage and came back, and in 1782 published accounts of how lucrative this sea otter trade would be at Canton. Over up to 200% profit at Canton. And in the next year, Boston men started going to seek out this trade, right? It was, again, this timing was significant. So many ships departed from Boston to the northwest coast in search of the sea otter in the years between 1783 and 1810 that all Americans in that region came to be called Boston men, right? By 1808, there was a really rapid turnaround in the success of this trade for Americans. So by 1808, with much of Europe embroiled in war, right, and distracted from this trade, American merchants quickly became leaders in the field, right? And these men from Massachusetts, when they had some success in trade, some of them had been captains, some of them had been supercargoes. They came back and set up their own firms in Boston and Salem, around Massachusetts, right, or in the cities in Massachusetts. And eventually, the sea otter trade would die out, right? This was a non-renewable resource, right? It would die down for a variety of reasons, and opium, primarily from Turkey, would take its place by the 1820s. And so while some of the most desirable opium came from India, the British had a lock on that. So the Americans found this other place to obtain opium. Opium became the most profitable item for Americans to trade at Canton from the mid to late 19th century, really. And certainly this trade contributed to the florescence of Boston and Salem too through the 19th century. So that's just a very brief overview of the trade, and that's the broad story. And today we're going to find out about, of course, human interactions were part of this. So today we're going to hear stories about human interactions in the context of this trade. So I think Caroline will speak first.
Okay.
Can we turn this for you?
Sure. Hi, I'd like to especially thank Sarah for putting this together, and thank Gwenn also for the work you've done on that. And it's really great to be back here at the Mass Historical Society. So I've recently, the title of this is Family, Fortunes, and Foreign Luxuries, and I've recently turned my attention away from commodities and more towards interpersonal relationships that were formed during trade, and wanting to look more. I've always been interested in what people thought of other people, and I tried to do that through porcelain and tea because the United States, the Americans had no direct contact with China before that. So looking at the period after the Revolution, I want to see what types of interpersonal interactions occurred between Chinese people and American people. And so I'm looking more at families and fortunes, less at foreign luxuries here. The Chinese have tended to be faceless in our narratives, just like this silhouette here by Ruth Henshaw Bascom. Here, this mysterious Chinese artist who visited New England in the 1840s is faceless. And the Chinese, likewise, have been effaced in our narratives of the China trade. And I think that it's important to bring back these individuals. One thing that I think is very important to realize is that early on, well, in New England, we like to think of ourselves as maritime people. And there is a lore around the brawny Yankee sailor. And there's people here have been wont to grant that expertise in sailing to other people. But in fact, the Chinese had been maritime people for a long, long time. From a very early time period, they were spreading out across the China Sea into Southeast Asia and even across the Indian Ocean. And I'm looking here at our early modern period, which is the second half of the Ming and the first half of the Qing dynasties in China. We see that the Chinese went to all of these different locations and settled down and developed farms and stores and created small Chinatowns or small communities in each of these places across Southeast Asia. These were the Maritime Chinese. So in our discussion of the variety of traders that went to Canton, we also need to consider the Maritime Chinese. The Maritime Chinese were trading in China, just as the English were, the Dutch were, the Arabs were before them. And here we see the locations that they were coming from, and it's below Shanghai, the whole Fujian coast there, and much of Guangdong province, especially the area of Guangzhou and the Pearl River Delta. You have Chinese people leaving. You've got people of different dialects, the Hakka, the Hokkien, the other Chinese dialects here, the Wu dialect, and then of course the Cantonese. By the way, in the United States, 98% of the Chinese people here hail from Cantonese-speaking areas, so the Chinese Americans were. And so the Chinese tended to go to places where their families had gone before. They created settlements, and when Americans arrived in this part of the world, they were doing a lot of what was called tramp trading, because just as Gwenn mentioned, they didn't know what the Chinese wanted to buy. And so they would stop here and there and trade the goods they had for goods that would be more desirable in China. There was a lot of trying to figure it out. And they were doing that because they were meeting Chinese communities en route to China who could help them with that. And there was very important relationships formed with these Chinese en route. The most famous example of that, of course, is Manila, as far as the Spanish were concerned, because of the dictum laid down by the Pope that Portugal had the western part of these images and Spain had the eastern part. The Spanish set up a base in Manila, and the Chinese quickly went there and made a big settlement, and because of that Chinese settlement in Manila, the Spanish were able to get access to all of China. So it was the Chinese mariners who were going to China to do the trading for people. And we know very, very little about those relationships. So I can't tell you much about them, but it's something that I want to learn more about. It's something I'm going to be looking at more of. So by the time the Americans got to Canton, chances are the merchants there were prepared and waiting for them, because news travels fast, as we know, along the sea lanes. And after 1754, the laws on out-migration, because of population pressure and economic pressure, were relaxed in China. And so even more, after 1754, even more Chinese people were headed out into other parts of South China Sea. So what we don't recognize in our China trade stories is that the Chinese were out there, seafaring people, very much part of the trade. Here we see a scene from the harbor of Canton. Actually, I wanted to look at this one first. Here's a scene by a Chinese artist out at sea. You see an East India Company ship there on the left. a smaller Asian ship on the right. And you see that their ocean-going vessels, the Chinese junks, were very large. In terms of volume and capital expended, the Chinese overseas junk trade equaled that of the foreign trade. About 90% of the vessels in the harbor of Canton were Chinese vessels, and that includes the Whampoa area where the foreign vessels were required to stop. And so you have a lot of Chinese out in the seas interacting with people before you even get to the coastline. In China, in Canton, much of the incoming foreign capital was returned back into Chinese shipping, specifically into the overseas junk trade. And there's a whole host of statistics that point out how prevalent the Chinese were in these ports and how prevalent the junk trade from China was there, but I don't have time to go into that. Most of the Hong merchants that Americans dealt with also owned ships and were trading themselves without the products from Southeast Asia, such as the tin and from Borneo, the rantan from Vietnam, which the tin was used to line the tea chest, the rantan was used to wrap the silk in. Without these items from Southeast Asia, the trade wouldn't have worked. In addition, there were things like the bird nests and other rice. A lot of rice from Southeast Asia came back into China with their growing population in the 18th century. So Americans may have been into the fur trade very much so at the beginning of the 19th century, but there was one item that they brought more than any other into Canton, and that was silver. And the word spread very fast that these new people, the flowery flag people, were carrying hard cash. Because at that point, the East India Company, who was the other big trader in Canton, was using a lot of debt and letters of debt and letters of credit. And so you have Americans coming with hard cash. Americans had access to the silver mines of New Spain. They knew all of those ports, and they knew how to smuggle. They had the small ships that could smuggle items out. And so they became the main carriers of silver into China. And therefore, they were very popular when they arrived because they had boatloads of silver. And they quickly made good friends with a number of the Hong merchants, or friends, as we might say. One thing that the Chinese merchants and the American merchants had in common was their number one goal was to make a profit. So we talk a lot about the Chinese not being a capitalist economy, but there was this cohort of Chinese who were very much thinking in the same terms as our merchants were thinking. And the idea was to, deploy capital in a way that could make you a profit. Trade, thinking about this, trade, especially itinerant, multi-situated, long-distance trade, is not merely a market transaction, however, of matching commodities to prices. It is contingent on a set of relationships and imaginaries that infuse those transactions. Market transactions were embodied. They were visualized and negotiated before being concretized. The visualizations that traders approached each other with in interaction depended entirely on their own cultural baggage, their own cultural stereotype. And so often I saw with American merchants as they would arrive in Canton, this is definitely the case of Sullivan Dorr, who did not like being in Canton very much, and during his whole time period there saw what he thought he was going to see. He wrote a lot of letters published by the Massachusetts Historical Society, and in those letters he complains bitterly, and the complaints echo so much of the stereotypes that had existed in the second half of the 18th century in colonial America about the Chinese. Yet there are many examples of very close relationships between these Chinese merchants and Americans. And not only Chinese merchants, but other types of Chinese. Here we have the ophthalmologist, Dr. Parker, in his office in a building that he rented from Hokwa, and his student physician assistant who he's training. And so this was a very close relationship Dr. Parker had with Chinese men. And this is one type of important relationship that occurred. There was also many, many Chinese sailors who sailed the world. And Americans, like anybody else, lost sailors en route. People jumped ship, people died, people got picked up by other ships, and they arrived in Canton short of men, and they were forced to hire sailors there for the voyage back. They offered very, very high wages, probably the highest that any Chinese sailor could want. Very few Chinese sailors wanted to go this far. They knew that it would be difficult to get back, and it often was, but by the early 19th century, you do begin to see a lot of Chinese sailors walking around the wharfs of Boston and Salem and in these areas, and even in Nantucket. One of the best-known examples, however, of a relationship is that of Hokwa, the preeminent, very wealthy merchant, a Hong merchant in China, with the Perkins, Cushing, Russell clan and Forbes clan. Many of us are well aware of this relationship. Hokwa was called Wu Bingjian in Chinese, and he became so close with these traders from Boston that he trusted them perhaps more than many people in China. It's an interesting question to explore why these sorts of close relationships happened with American merchants when they weren't happening so much with the British merchants. Hokwa ends up at the suggestions of John P. Cushing to invest in railroads in the United States. He had the Boston merchants to his Canton home for dinner, or it was rather a banquet of many courses and entertainment that lasted for 13 hours. It was one of the most lavish dinners these people had had, and at this point, the people from this part of the world looked up to the southern plantation owners as, really fancy lifestyles, but Hokwa outdid them. And I don't have a picture of Hokwa's house, but I have the fountain court of Consiqua's house. Now, Consiqua was another Hong merchant who was very close to a number of American merchants, quite close friendships, with especially merchants from Philadelphia. But he was also quite close to John Jacob Astor from New York, who actually went to court to get Consiqua repaid debts by other American merchants. So you see Chinese and American merchants aligning against other American merchants. The Chinese Hong community tended to work more closely together and cover for each other because disharmony in that quarter was virtually against the law in China. So whereas competition was something that nobody winked at in the United States, that was fine for people to be taking each other to court. Hokwa was also nearly persuaded to move to the United States at the time of the Opium War. He became so close with Cushing and Perkins and Forbes that he even thought of moving to the United States and decided not to because he was probably in his 80s at that time, or 70s. He was quite old. And then the Cushing-Forbes clan managed Hokwa's money all the way up until the 1880s, well after Hokwa died, and served as his trust agency. And they paid out money every year to Hokwa's children. So that's one type of interpersonal relationship that can form. And I think for Americans and some Hong merchants, this was not an unusual sort of relationship. We see here James Carey of Nantucket in a painting by Spoilum with its companion painting of Chunghwa, the merchant, and obviously someone he did close business with. And he was so fond of Chunghwa that he asked Spoilum, he commissioned these paintings as companion paintings to hang in his house when he got home to remember Chunghwa by. So for the rest of this talk, I want to talk about one particular Chinese merchant that I've been looking into very closely, who's a big mystery. How much time do I have left? Maybe 3 minutes. But I've done an extensive amount of research on a guy named Punghua Wing Chong, who was what they call an outside merchant. So here's Punghua Wing Chong's he came to the United States in 1807, which is highly unusual. And because of that, usually the Hong merchants or the merchants in Canton had somebody in the United States do their business for them in collecting debt. But Mr. Wing Chong came here. And I'm not sure what exactly his name was, and Wing Chong was probably the name of his firm or his business, and Pung Hua was probably the honorarium that merchants usually get called, but we'll leave that to further discussion. But in 1785, he or his father or somebody else in the Wing Chong family firm loaned money to the Empress of China's supercargo, which would be Thomas Randall and Samuel Shaw. And that money was never repaid. I suspect that Thomas Randall used it to buy the ship Palas, or some of it. And Wing Chong is known to have been lending out money. He, after coming to the United States, he returned, and he's in Carrington, Ed Carrington's account books as loaning money to Americans then too. So this happened in 1785. He was never repaid. So in 1807, he boards the Favorite, which was a ship out of Nantucket, to come collect the money from Shaw and Randall. He arrives in New York, finds out that Shaw is dead and Randall is destitute practically with hard labor, can barely support his family. And then the Chesapeake Leopard affair happened right off the coast, which was sort of a spark for the War of 1812, but an initial spark, but this was some shots were exchanged over impressing sailors between the English and the Americans, and the port was closed down. So I think Mr. Wing Chong had intended to come, get his debt, and travel back on the Beaver, John Jacob Astor's ship, the Beaver, but everything was shut down. So he had to wait until things cooled off. Things did not cool off. He went to Nantucket with the people that he'd come over on the ship with. And then at the end of that year, Jefferson enacted the embargo. Wow, he's really stuck here now. And he's in Nantucket, and it's winter, and that probably was no fun. It was a really economically depressed place, blubber smelling, and abandoned women, and there he was. But he managed to go to a few tea parties, which we'll hear about. But just to finish his story, by the end of in the summer of 1808, he wrote a letter to Jefferson. It got Jefferson's attention. There's the letter. We have it right there. And the Chinese characters are pulled out are what, working with Chinese scholars, we think to be Pung Hua Wing Chong's name in this letter. He got passage back to, he traveled to Washington and got passage back to China on a John Jacob Astor's Beaver. And John Jacob Astor was giddy. Okay, everybody's stuck at home, but I get to travel to China with an empty ship and this Mandarin, as people called him. So there were many complaints in newspapers you can read. People were aghast, the ship owners were aghast that John Jacob Astor was going to get to go with an empty ship to China. So one letter is of interest here. It was written to Madison at the time, and I'll just summarize a couple of points. But he said here, Mr. Wing Chong, who is represented as a Chinese Mandarin, I know well. That's very interesting. I knew him before he left Canton. He is no more a Mandarin than one of our shopkeepers is. For that is what he is. That is his occupation. And in fact, here we see a street in Canton from a little later, but it probably looked very similar. And you see these stalls here. These are the shops. So Mr. Pung Hua Wing Chong runs a shop, which I think was a side business. I think it was a maritime family. I think he probably had family abroad in Cochin, China, or somewhere else in Southeast Asia, and had been doing a lot of maritime business on the side. They had a lot of goods. They were trading in a shop in Canton. He got into money lending to Americans, which probably wasn't a good idea. Okay, so this anonymous letter says he's a shopkeeper. That he came away from China and must return by stealth, I am sure of, because, and he goes on to say many things, but basically they would strip him of every cent he is worth if they found out that he had left the country. It was really not a good thing to do. Even the Chinese sailors who engaged with American ships had to leave by stealth, which usually meant via Macau or Lintin Island. This letter goes on to say, some time ago I received a letter from Mr. Whitney, who was the supercargo of the Favorite, who knew Mr. Wing Chong brought him from China. Mr. Whitney says, the gentleman that brought, he stated that he wished me to be friendly to Wing Chong, as he had not exceeding $500 with him. And surely Mr. Whitney ought to know. Wing Chong holds notes from Shaw and Randall to a large amount, and that he came to this country for the express purpose of collecting that debt. The letter also says it would be cruel to the highest degree for any person to object to Mr. Wing Chong and the other Chinese person with him, he came in company with a secretary, to return to their native country. But he is no Mandarin. God forbid I should injure Mr. Wing Chong, who considers me a friend. But it is necessary you should possess correct information on this subject. In other words, this letter is telling the president via Madison that he should not have let the Astor's ship go back to China with this Mandarin, because he's not a Mandarin and he's not wealthy, and nobody is going to be impressed by our bringing him home, which was the pretext for sending the ship out with him. What's interesting to me here is this author of this letter, Columbus, and I still don't know who it is, and I have the handwritten letter, and I'd like to get the time to take it around to people and find out if anybody recognizes the handwriting. But he says he's a good friend of Mr. Wing Chong's, and he says that to the point where he really doesn't want to hurt him. He really wants to help him out. So from the letters back and forth between Wing Chong and the people that what I didn't note in the initial history is that he did come back to the United States 3 times again. And to make a long story short, I believe that he had become very interested in Quakers, because all the people he visits are Quakers, and he writes letters to friends with a capital F. So that's an interesting part of Mr. Wing Chong's relationship with Americans. So from these letters that I've read, we know that he's well-liked and respected as a gentleman. But in the U.S., it's important to remember that he is first and foremost a Chinaman, a racial type from an exotic, remote, and alien part of the world. And then he's secondly a man. And this Chinaman part of him is very hard to overcome. I will just give you one example. While he was in Nantucket over the winter, Keziah Coffin Fanning had him to tea with Mrs. Burrell. This is the old Coffin homestead, by the way, here in Nantucket, and that's Keziah, who married the brother of Edward Fanning, who wrote the famous Voyage Around the World in 4 years. So she had a tea party with Mrs. Burrell, E. Chase, and Nancy Fanning, and the Chinaman. So he doesn't have a name. He's a Chinaman. The other people have names. He's the Chinaman that came with Mr. Whitney. He's a merchant there, and he is the color of our native whites. So he's first and foremost to these people a raced individual. You know, this is something that's very interesting to them. So I just want to end thinking about what you do when you're in trade and trading with competitors is sometimes you marry your daughters to your competitors, and you form family alliances that way that are absolutely the best thing you can count on in trade. And that way you become a more powerful entity together. And doing business with family is the best way to know that you can trust the people you're doing business with. Marriage, and there's been quite a lot of interesting work on this, marriage was a primary means of building trusted business ties and capital in early America. But what happened when one was working with someone of a different country, different ethnicity, religion, and race? Mutual mistrust could not be mitigated with the scrutiny of a marriageable daughters and a family bond. Intermarriage between Americans and Chinese was unthinkable in 19th century China and America. Wing Chong and his business partners in New York and Nantucket could form friendships, very close friendships. Wing Chong could even convert to Quakerism and develop mutual admiration from one another, but they would never be able to fully trust one another in business as family, because the conjugal filament of shared interest wasn't possible. So I'm going to stop there. I had a few more things to show you, but I think that's sort of the point of what I'm making here. And I'm in process of trying to find out more about Penghu Wing Chun. Thank you.
For my part, I would like us to complicate tonight's theme of families and fortunes and foreign luxuries. I'd like us to consider that what connected Massachusetts to the China trade was not just exotic goods, but the stories that Massachusetts families told themselves, told their neighbors, told each other, told the world about what it was like to travel to China. Furthermore, belying the mythologies of fame and fortune and adventure that were created, especially by historians of the early 20th century. These stories were about ordinary men and sometimes women who were struggling to find their place in the world. What bound these families together were tales of misfortune. They told stories of those who prospered, certainly, and we're all familiar with those stories, but they told stories also of men and women who lost everything. And it was those stories of struggle, of gain and loss that connected the people of Massachusetts to the China trade as well. So let's begin with a story from January of 1766, almost 20 years before Americans sailed the Stars and Stripes to Canton. Two representatives of Massachusetts's notable families are having dinner. One is this fellow. You can find this image in the Harvard libraries, as well as there's a little museum about 10 minutes down the street where I think you might find something. This is Merchant Nicholas Boylston. He is hosting the repast, the dinner, in his sumptuous home on School Street, a structure so elegantly appointed that people call it the Mansion House. One of the guests is a middling farmer named John Adams. I think there's something about him in this place, too. Returning to Braintree that evening, Adams regaled his family and his neighbors with descriptions of, and these are his words, the most magnificent of anything I have ever seen. Well, what was so magnificent were items from China, from India, from Turkey. Adams describes rooms filled with exotic goods imported from around the globe, a rosewood bed from China, ornamented with silk damask curtains, a Coromandel screen from Madras, wallpapered rooms perhaps featuring scenes of peacocks and pagodas, rooms layered with Turkey carpets. If Adams had been an intimate, he might have caught a sight of Boylston in his Indian-styled banyan and his Arabian tam. Well, stories like this, stories that Adams regaled family and friends with, were part and parcel of the consciousness of Massachusetts, even 20 years before Americans sailed overseas. And these stories whet the appetites of people from Boston, from Salem, from Marblehead, to see what was on, in the phrase of the time, t'other side of the world. Let's move to a little later now, another story. This time we're in New York. It's May 19th, 1785. And a week before, just a little over a week before, a ship flying the Stars and Stripes, called the Empress of China has just returned. We see in a boarding house at a borrowed desk a Boston merchant named Samuel Shaw, and he's dispatching a letter at that desk that will transform American consciousness. Shaw has just returned from a voyage unlike any that any American has taken before. As supercargo, aboard the ship, he had sailed across the globe, he had anchored in the Peiho River, he had traded Appalachian ginseng for Cantonese teas and porcelains, and he had made a fortune, or at least 25% by today's standards seems like a fortune. The voyage made for remarkable stories that filled 2 journals, which are available here in the archives here. Shaw related the experiences of America's first direct contact with China and recounted anecdotes of typhoons and pirates and dinner parties with mandarins and Hong merchants, and the unfortunate affair of the Lady Hughes, a British ship on which a gunner, someone manning a cannon, had mistakenly killed a Chinese boatman, and for which he paid with his life. Shaw related especially, he writes to Foreign Minister John Jay. He has his letter published in newspapers. He tells his stories to anyone who will listen. He hopes to write a multi-volume book about his adventures. The most important thing that happens, the most important China trade experience for Shaw is, as he writes, the reception that American citizens have met. We are the new people. We're the new people on the global stage, and we have been received with, he says, politeness, with cordiality, with civility, he says. This matters because the new nation is untried, it's untested, and we're trying to gain admittance into what he calls the community of civilized nations. For his part, Samuel Shaw introduced the luxuries of the East, carried directly from exotic ports to Boston. But this is more typical. His career as a China trader ends after 4 voyages in 1794. He dies of a tropical fever, a liver disease, and was buried at the Cape of Good Hope. He never finds the success, the what they call competency that he had been searching for. Let's switch now to a few years later, 6 years later. We're at Whampoa. I love this. This is in the Atwater Kent Museum in Philadelphia, and this is the only representation we have of the Empress of China in 1784. And you'll see her birth. I think this is the Empress right here. It's 1790. It's 6 years later. This time the stories are told by Amasa Delano of Duxbury, Massachusetts. He is second mate on the ship Massachusetts. He has just landed at Whampoa Reach, right here, below Canton, about 12 miles below Guangzhou. Delano relates that they had approached the China Sea at the beginning of monsoon season. Their timing was not good. We, quote, we experienced a typhoon that split the mainsail, the foretopsail, the foretopmast staysail. But owing to our ships being built in Massachusetts, and what did that got? And therefore being an excellent seaboat, we weathered the gale and suffered only trifling damage compared with some other ships. Now, adding to the drama, he makes note, one Dutch ship was totally lost among the islands in Canton Bay, together with all the crew. This, again, is more typical of the China trade that Massachusetts men and some women experienced. And he has, there's Amasa Delano. This is his book, published in Boston in 1817, a narrative of voyages and travels, 3 voyages around the world. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. You can find it here in the MHS. And he publishes this chart that I think epitomizes the China trade. Massachusetts' experience and stories of the China trade as much as anything. It's the right-hand column that is particularly noteworthy. Now living the state of Vermont, dead, died at Macau, dead, died at Canton, dead, died in England. Living on the Penobscot River was as good as being dead, I guess. A slave in Algiers, died and thrown overboard off Cape Horn, lost overboard off of Japan, and it goes on and on and on. Delano's own fortunes paled. He lived to a ripe old age, dying in 1826. He had made 3 voyages from Boston around the globe. He published this book in 1817, but he appears to have lost as much money as he gained. And he made his living mostly off of his wife Hannah's boarding house near Mill Street. Do we have time for more stories? I think we do a couple more. A ship might survive, but the effects would be traumatic. And those traumas and those struggles and those losses were captured, again, in the stories that the people of Massachusetts told each other. Friends and loved ones shared in the losses. A decade after a typhoon swept his brother Thomas into the Peiho River, summer of 1829, a decade after that, Robert Bennett Forbes passed over his brother's watery grave. He wrote his wife, Rose, who was back in Boston, he confided to her, "I cannot help feeling," that's Forbes, early Forbes, young Forbes. And he, again, captures his stories in book after book after book. "I cannot help feeling a little dull, though the long years have elapsed since that fatal gale. 10 years ago today, or yesterday perhaps, the remains of that brother were deposited in their present home. That when he died, we were just beginning to feel like brothers has always been a source of great pain to me." It was this event that actually brought a third brother, 17-year-old John Murray Forbes, to Canton to clerk in the family business. What John Murray Forbes grew up with were stories of his brother Thomas. What he grew up with was a bar set so high. He must be the hero that his brother Thomas had been, it was said. Well, again, what I'm trying to get at is stories like this connected the community of China traders to each other and connected those China traders to their families back home in Massachusetts. And again, adding to the drama, just a week before Robert Bennett's return to China in 1838, he writes, "There happened again," almost as if marking the anniversary of his brother's death. "There happened again another hard typhoon," they called them typhoons because they weren't used to the language, "in which an English ship foundered with all her crew, and one large junk sank with severe damage." The Forbes family would bring opium into China and luxuries into Boston, but the stories that they captured would come into Massachusetts also and shape Massachusetts' sense of its own identity. Do we have time for one more? Should we finish here?
We should maybe have a moment, people.
Yeah, you guys should talk too. Okay. I have another story. I have lots of stories. The next book. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple questions. Dr. Frank, earlier on in your speech, you mentioned that there were Chinese sailors coming to New England.
Right.
What are the sources for that? Where did you find information on that?
The best source is an author called Paul Van Dyke, who's written I know he's written a book called Macau and the Americans, which I actually have with me, and another one, The Canton Trade. And he is a Chinese historian. He speaks Old Dutch, French, English, Old English, German, Chinese, and all the Cantonese, and so he's really one of the most knowledgeable people there is about the trade. But he's also my source for looking at outside merchants, the shopkeepers that Peng Wing Chong was. And, so he, of the linguists who worked with the traders, he's a great source for all of that.
Was there any guilt among the merchants about introducing opium? Or did you sense that it was just these people weren't quite human because they weren't Europeans? Or?
I was so hoping someone would ask that question.
What was the question?
The question was there any sense of guilt among the merchants of Massachusetts for selling opium in China? And I would answer as much guilt as people feel about climate change, about refugees. They're just like us. They're embroiled in controversy. People are writing that what we're doing is morally and legally wrong. The Chinese have banned opium smuggling. What we're doing is wrong. But you also have a great number of defenders. They're sharing their stories. They're putting their stories into print, and it's and the resolution is simply on the side of interest rather than morality, monetary interest rather than morality. So again, I know this is a bit of a stretch, but it's not that different from our conversations about climate change or anything else today. But thank you.
Can I add to that? That there were a couple of merchants who absolutely refused to engage in opium, and I can't remember his name. Oliphant. I knew it was an O. Oliphant. I was thinking Oglethorpe. Oliphant. And a few other smaller merchants. Oliphant was a merchant house, American merchant house. He refused to do opium, and some others did. But you even have the missionary press, the Canton Register, which was started by missionaries, that are printing the prices of the opium. So I think that I do heartily agree with Dale that it was profit over any other motive. And the Americans were, Jack Downs, who writes The Golden Ghetto, which is a wonderful source about the China trade, says that the entire American merchant community in Canton would have collapsed without opium sales after 1820.
And that the Chinese government also wouldn't have gotten as much profit without opium sales, even though it was illegal. But just one other small thing is that Robert Bennett Forbes, I mentioned this last week, did kind of compare opium to alcohol and say, and kind of, couched it in those terms, that it was a similar thing that could be controlled.
If anybody's interested in following the arguments, there was in the Canton Register, there was a great debate between Robert Bennett Forbes and Charles King, and they write lengthy essays pro and con the opium trade in China. It's It's really a delicious debate.
It's not a topic either person had commented on, but on the map that you had of the local China trade, it had an arrow that pointed, it said to USA and Canada. And I know that there's, I think his name is Gavin Menzies, wrote an article, a book about, the Chinese supposedly having circumnavigated the Earth 500 years ago. So I was questioning whether somebody supported what the origin of that arrow is on the map, if anybody knows.
I find Gavin Menzies' arguments really compelling, but I will say that the entire historic community, scholars think that it's a crock. It's not worth looking at. But his arguments are really well constructed, but I think that people who really know that early history of maritime voyaging don't think it happened. Although the Chinese with Zheng He did get as far as Italy and were in Europe, there's no reason they couldn't have, but there's, I guess, not good evidence that they did.
But there was that exhibition at the MFA a couple of years ago about the China trade in South America that seemed to indicate that, I believe in the 18th century, they were exporting blue and white ceramics to Chile.
Oh, there were Chinese people in the 18th century in Mexico, but we're talking about, Gavin Menzies is talking about 1421. Right. So he's talking about the before Columbus. So
that the Chinese might have been the first to the Americas rather than
the Vikings.
You're right.
I would just add that at the MFA show that those Chinese works were transported by the Spanish from Manila to Acapulco.
Right.
So that's how they got there.
But in the 18th century, there were Chinese potters that had been brought over to Mexico who were making pots. The
majority was Manila galleon.
Right.
On the question of trade with Canada, to what extent was there trade with British North America and China, and how early did it begin? That's new to me.
Well, there was Chinese objects and tea and porcelain and all of that, the commodities, the luxuries, coming into the American colonies very early via the West Indies. Because the Dutch West Indies and the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company would swing into the Atlantic from the Indian Ocean and go directly to the Caribbean and exchange their goods and places there. And that was the primary source of tea for the Americas, was from that location. There were Americans that made it to the Indian Ocean in the 17th century. But then with the hanging of William Kidd, and they were all labeled pirates, and it was the British really cracked down, and that was the end of that.
But actual trade between Canada and China?
That was probably with the seal. Now you would probably know.
What date are you talking about, Dawn?
Yeah, it depends on the date. Yeah.
What date are you talking about?
Well, that's what I'm asking. How early?
So the charter of the British East India Company in December of 1600 gives them a monopoly on all trade eastward of Good Hope, eastward of the Cape of Good Hope. So they bring goods to London, and those goods are then transshipped to the British colonies. In Canada, before 1763, it would have been the French East Indies companies, but they're scattershot. The companies form, they disband. They form, they disband. So, and as Carolyn notes, a lot of goods coming to Canada may well have been re-exported through the West Indies.
Yeah.
Archaeological sites of British military forts in Canada during the 18th century and maybe even 17th century have Chinese porcelain on them. And some of that porcelain made its way into Native American communities, and so it's there.
Is that like in the eastern Canada or in western?
I'm thinking up by the Great Lakes and north of the Great Lakes and the Lake of the Woods and all of that area. But there was the French trade going through there too, and at a certain point, all people in Europe had tea and porcelain, and the tea became a staple. So chances are it was being carried into Canada.
One of the experts on the Russian settlements in Canada, early Canada, is sitting right next to me.
Right. That was more about the fur trade, though.
I think that because in those days that Canadian territories were also very much fodder for different nations vying for the territories, that also explained why companies were, emerging and then being disbanded, and because there was a lot of political unrest, and so I think that it gave way to at once a lot of uncertainty, but also opportunity, and it could explain maybe why you could find some Chinese importation or even export, but Canadian goods hadn't really formed at that point. There wasn't such a thing as really a Canadian identity, I think. So I think that's different, where Americans were very well established in their cultural identity. I have a quick question. Some women accompanied their husbands on these trips, and Chinese women were very much business women. Now, is there documents that talk about women trading with women, or women accompanying, their husbands?
Well, Harriet Lowe is the most well-known case, and she was not allowed in Canton. Women, there was 12 rules that the people had to follow, and one of them was no women allowed in Canton. And so families, there we go.
I mean, women were often acting as missionaries more at mid-century. That was kind of
after
their prime work.
After the Opium.
Yeah, after the Opium Wars.
But women weren't trading or doing business.
Well, there were women, but they were the offshore boat women, the Don people, who were doing laundry for the sailors and bringing them fish and providing them with all sorts of goods. And actually, there's some evidence that some relationships formed between some of the sailors and these Don women traders, but there certainly, I don't think, was women-to-women trading unless it was happening in Macau.
Were the families?
Which I haven't encountered any of those.
Maybe one more question.
The painting of the Chinese ship, was that fanciful, or did people actually dig up ships that size?
He's asking if this is a fanciful painting or if this was actually painted after a ship. And I don't know the artist. I don't know the answer. I know it was done by a Chinese artist, and it's in the National Maritime Museum in London. So you might want to go to their website. But it is an authentic, if you look at the pictures of the ship, the Qing, which in the 1840s was a Chinese junk that traveled to the United States, and it became a museum piece and a site, and it was like the circus coming to town. The Qing would pull into town, and people would pay money to go on it, and it was organized by some American China merchant. If you look at that ship, it looks very much like this one. And the dwarfing there is happening because of the perspective, I think. If this is a Chinese artist who's trained in Western painting style. And I don't know when this painting was painted. I ran across it actually the last few days. This one, however, is an authentic painting by William Daniel in this time period. So you see the size of this ship is very impressive. Yeah. Right? So.
Okay.